There are truths buried in Louisiana soil that no official record ever documented. Stories whispered between generations, kept in burned diaries, erased from birth certificates. This is the story of a discovery that divided an entire community, not because nobody knew what was happening, but because everyone knew and no one could admit it. When light-skinned babbies began appearing in the slave cabins of Belle Reve Plantation, eyes looked away, mouths shut tight, and secrets began growing like weeds between the cotton rows. What you are about to hear isn't about ghosts or curses. It's about something far more terrible. The truth. The midwife known as Aunt Ruth had seen many things in her 63 years of life. Her hands had brought over 200 children into the world in the cabins of Belle Reve and neighboring plantations along the Mississippi River. She knew every type of complication, every danger sign, every peculiarity that nature could present during birth. But on that April night in 1847, when she was called to Sarah's cabin, a girl of barely 16 years, Ruth felt something different in the air. The labor had been long. Sarah's screams had quieted to exhausted whimpers as dawn approached. Ruth worked by the light of 2 candles, her experienced hands guiding the process she'd performed hundreds of times before. The other women who'd gathered to help, Mary Hattie and old Cora, stood in the shadows, their faces tense with worry that seemed to go beyond normal concern for a difficult birth. When the baby finally emerged, Ruth's hands froze. The child was pale, not the reddish tone of a newborn of mixed heritage, not the deep brown of Sarah's own skin, but pale with skin the color of fresh cream, hair that would clearly lighten to blonded or light brown, and features that would raise questions no one on Believe wanted to answer. The silence in that cabin was absolute. Ruth had been a midwife long enough to know what silence meant. She wrapped the baby quickly, her movements mechanical, her face carefully blank. She placed the infant in Sarah's arms without meeting the young mother's eyes. Sarah looked down at her daughter and began to cry, not tears of joy, tears that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere Ruth recognized but couldn't name in that moment. "She healthy," Sarah whispered. "She healthy's," Ruth confirmed. "She going to live. She going to live." But both women knew that wasn't really the question Sarah was asking. Mary stepped forward from the shadows, her voice barely audible. "Anybody know yet?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "Not yet. But come morning," she didn't need to finish. Come morning, the overseer would make his rounds. Come morning, the news would spread. Come morning, everyone would know and everyone would understand exactly what it meant. The baby was named Claire, though Sarah had wanted to name her something else, something that didn't sound so obvious, but Aunt Ruth had insisted in that firm way she had when she knew something important. "Give her a name that fits how she looked," Ruth had said. "Make it easier on everyone." Sarah hadn't understood then, but she would. Within 3 months, another light-skinned baby was born in the quarters, this time to a woman named Dinah who was 20 years old and had already buried 1 child. The baby boy had hair that was distinctly orange and eyes that would turn green by his first birthday. Dinah named him Thomas. By the end of 1847, there were 4 such children in Belle Reve's slave quarters. By the end of 1848, there were 9. The pattern was impossible to ignore, yet everyone pretended not to see it. The white families who lived in the big plantation houses along that stretch of the Mississippi continued their social visits. They attended church together on Sundays. They discussed crops and weather and politics. Their wives organized charity events and quilting circles. And they never ever mentioned the babies. But in the slave quarters, there was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of women who understood too much and could say too little. The silence of mothers who held their light-skinned children a little tighter when footsteps approached. The silence of knowing. Aunt Ruth kept a mental record that she shared with no one. She noted which women gave birth to these children. She noted the timing. She noted the patterns of who disappeared from the fields or the big house on certain nights, and which babbies appeared 9 months later. And she noticed something else, something that made her blood run cold. The babies weren't random. They came in clusters. Certain months were worse than others. certain times of year when the master's brother visited from New Orleans, certain weeks when the overseer's cousin came to stay, certain seasons when particular guests occupied the guest quarters. It was systematic. It was predictable. It was happening by design. As the children grew, the problem became more visible. Claire, Sarah's daughter, had blue eyes and hair that lightened to honey blonde by age 3. She stood out among the other children like a daisy in a field of wheat. Visitors to Belle would stop and stare, their faces showing confusion, then understanding, then careful neutrality. Thomas developed freckles across his nose. His green eyes and reddish hair made him look like he could have belonged to any of the Irish families working the docks in New Orleans. A little girl named Lily had straight brown hair and features so European that she could have walked through the French Quarter without a single person questioning her presence. The children played together in the dirty yards between cabins, but even among themselves they were different. The other children treated them with a strange mixture of distance and protectiveness, as if they understood, even at that young age, that these children carried a burden that made them dangerous to know. Martha, one of the older enslaved women who worked in the big house, watched all of this with growing dread. She'd been at Belle for 34 years, since she was 10 years old. She'd seen 3 generations of the Belmont family run the plantation. She'd seen masters come and go, overseers hired and fired, children born and buried, but she'd never seen anything like this. One evening in late 1849, Martha sat with Aunt Ruth on the steps of Ruth's cabin, shelling peas in the fading light. They worked in silence for a long time before Martha finally spoke. "How many now?" she asked quietly. Ruth didn't ask what she meant. 14 living. 2 didn't make it past their first year. They getting older? Yes, people going to start asking questions. People already asking questions, Ruth said, just not out loud. Martha's hands stilled in the bowl of peas. What they going to do with them children, Ruth's, when they get older, when they old enough that people can't pretend no more? Ruth didn't answer because she didn't have an answer. She'd been asking herself the same question for 2 years now, and every possibility she considered ended in tragedy. In March of 1850, a slave trader named Chester Booth arrived at Belle. This wasn't unusual. Traders came through regularly looking to buy or sell, conducting the grim business that kept the plantation system running. But this visit was different. Booth spent 3 days at the plantation, and during those 3 days, he never once visited the adult quarters. Instead, he asked specifically to see the children. Word spread through the cabins faster than fire. Mothers grabbed their babies and held them close. The light-skinned children were hidden in root cellars, storage sheds, anywhere they might be overlooked. Aunt Ruth remembered watching from the door of her cabin as Booth walked through the quarters with Master Bauman's son, Henry. Henry was 26 years old, recently married to a woman from a prominent Charleston family and increasingly involved in running Belle. She watched Booth point at one cabin, then another. She watched Henry shake his head repeatedly. She watched the argument that ensued, conducted in voices too low to hear, but with body language that spoke volumes. Finally, Booth left Belle without purchasing a single person. That night, Henry Beaumont came to the quarters himself, something that almost never happened after dark. He walked to Sarah's cabin and stood in the doorway. "The child," he said simply. "Let me see her." As Sarah pulled Claire closer, her face showing terror, she tried desperately to hide. The 3-year-old girl looked up at the man in the doorway with curious blue eyes. Henry stared at the child for a long moment. His face was unreadable in the dim lantern light. Then he turned and walked away without another word. He visited 4 more cabins that night, looking at 4 more light-skinned children, saying nothing. Then he disappeared back toward the big house. The sale never happened, but everyone understood what it meant. Someone had wanted to buy the children. Someone had wanted to take them away, and Henry Beaumont had refused. The question that kept Ruth awake that night was simple. Why, Martha discovered the ledger by accident in the summer of 1851. She'd been cleaning Master Bowman's study, the old master, Henry's father, who was 71 now and increasingly frail. He spent most days in his wheeled chair, looking out over the plantation he'd built, saying little. The ledger had fallen behind the desk, wedged between the wall and a heavy filing cabinet. Martha only found it because she dropped a cleaning rag and had to reach into the narrow space to retrieve it. It was a small book, bound in dark leather with no label on the cover. Martha knew she shouldn't open it. Enslaved people caught reading could be punished severely, and being caught reading the master's private papers could mean far worse. But something about the hidden location, the unmarked cover, the way it had been concealed rather than filed with the other plantation records, something made her slide it into her apron. That night, by candle light in her cabin, Martha opened the ledger. She'd learned to read as a child, taught secretly by a previous master's daughter, who thought it would be entertaining to educate the house slaves. That young woman had died of yellow fever at age 14, and Martha had never revealed her literacy since. It was too dangerous. Knowledge was currency she couldn't spend without risking everything. But now, as she looked at the pages before her, she wished she'd never learned to read at all. The ledger was a record, a meticulous, detailed record. Names, dates, notations that made Martha's hands shake. Sarah, April 12, 1847. Female, light completion, noted. Diner, September 3, 1847. Male, auburn hair, problematic, Rachel, November 28, 1847. Female, eyes too light, requires monitoring page after page, entry after entry, each one documenting what Martha had suspected, but never wanted to confirm. But it was the notes in the margins that truly horrified her. Next to Sarah's entry, he visiting from Baton Rouge, March 1846. Next to Dinah's entry, Overseer Collins, dismissed, December 1847. Next to Rachel's entry, guest name unknown, winter party season. The ledger wasn't just recording births. It was recording paternity. It was documenting exactly who was responsible for each child, matching dates of conception with visits with guests, with the movements of free white men through Bull Reeve, and the handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Henry Bowman. Martha closed the ledger, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She understood now why Booth's sale had been refused. She understood the visits to the cabins that night. She understood why the children were still here. Henry wasn't protecting the children out of mercy. He was protecting evidence. He was protecting his family's reputation. He was protecting himself and every white man whose initials appeared in those margins. The children were witnesses, living, breathing proof of crimes that polite society pretended didn't exist, and Martha now held that proof in her hands. Martha knew she had to return the ledger before it was missed, but first she needed to tell someone who could understand the full implications of what she'd found. She went to Aunt Ruth. The old midwife sat very still as Martha whispered the contents of the ledger. When Martha finished, Ruth was quiet for so long that Martha wondered if she'd spoken at all. Finally, Ruth spoke. How many names in those margins? 17 different men. Ruth closed her eyes. Lord have mercy. What we going to do? Ruth's eyes opened sharp and hard. We ain't going to do nothing. You were going to put that book back exactly where you found it, and you were going to forget you ever saw it. But, Ruth, listen to me, child. Ruth's voice was steel. You think knowing this helps anybody? You think there's someone we can tell who don't already knows? You think there is justice somewhere waiting for women like Sarah and Dina and Rachel? Martha felt tears burning her eyes. Those children are alive because their existence is an embarrassment, not a crime. The day that ledger becomes public is the day those children become a problem that needs solving. And I've seen how rich white men solve their problems. The truth of it hit Martha like a physical blow. The ledger wasn't protection. It was a liability, and if anyone discovered it was missing, if anyone thought the enslaved people had seen it, had read it, had understood it, the children would disappear, the women would disappear. Anyone who knew too much would disappear. Put it back, Ruth said again, and pray nobody ever finds it. Martha returned the ledger the next morning, sliding it back into the gap behind the desk. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. She never touched it again, but she couldn't unknow what she'd read. Despite the fear, despite the knowledge, despite everything, the babies kept coming. 1,851 brought 3 more. 1,852 brought 2. 1,853 brought 4. By 1,854, there were 26 light-skinned children living in Belle Reeve's quarters, ranging from newborns to 7-year-olds. They represented nearly a quarter of all children born in the quarters during those years. The women who bore these children fell into a strange hierarchy. They were entrusted by some of the other enslaved people who saw them as collaborators or worse, but they weren't accepted by the white household either. Despite the evidence of their forced connections, they existed in a liminal space belonging nowhere. Sarah, now 23 years old, had given birth to 2 more children since Claire. One appeared a mixed race in the traditional sense. The other, a boy born in 1852, was nearly as pale as Claire herself. Sarah had stopped speaking much. She did her work in the fields with mechanical efficiency, her face a mask that revealed nothing. At night, she held her children and sang to them in a voice so quiet that only they could hear the words. Dinah had fared worse. After Thomas, she'd had one more light-skinned child, a girl who died at 6 months of fever. Dinah had stopped eating properly after that. She grew thin and distant, her eyes taking on a look that Aunt Ruth recognized as the beginning of the end. Some women broke under the weight of it. Others grew hard as iron. Rachel became the latter. She was 25 now, mother to 3 children, 2 of whom had light skin and European features. She'd begun speaking up in ways that terrified the other women, talking back to the overseer, working slowly enough to be noticed, maintaining eye contact when she should have looked away. She courting death, Martha whispered to Ruth one evening. She courting something worse than death, Ruth replied. She courting attention, and attention was the last thing any of them could afford. Everything changed when the inspector came. His name was Robert Finch, and he represented a religious organization from Boston that had been investigating conditions on southern plantations. It was 1854, and tensions between North and South were escalating. Abolitionists were becoming bolder, and some plantation owners, trying to counter the negative publicity, had begun allowing limited inspections to prove that enslaved people were well treated. Old Master Beaumont, now bedridden but still making decisions, had agreed to allow such an inspection at Belle Reeve. Henry had argued against it, but his father had overruled him. "We got nothing to hide," the old master had declared. "Let them see how well we treat our people." Finch arrived on a humid August morning with a notebook and a determined expression. He was in his 40s, then, and serious, with the seal of a man on a moral mission. Henry gave him a tour of the facilities, the quarters, the infirmary, the food distribution center, the chapel. Everything was in order, clean, designed to show Belle Reeve in the best possible light. But then Finch asked to observe the children. Henry's jaw tightened, but he couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. He led Finch to the area behind the cabins where the children, too young for field work, spent their days under the supervision of the older women. Finch stood and watched the children play for nearly 10 minutes. His expression shifted from neutral observation to confusion, then to something that might have been shock. He turned to Henry. "Some of these children appear to be, that is, their complexion is mixed heritage," Henry said smoothly. "Some of our people have white ancestry from previous generations. It shows up unexpectedly sometimes." It was a reasonable explanation. It was even partially true in some cases. But Finch was looking at Claire, who at 7 years old looked like she belonged in a schoolhouse in Boston, not a slave cabin in Louisiana. He was looking at Thomas, whose green eyes and freckles were impossible to explain away as previous generations. How many children of this complexion were born here? Finch asked carefully. I don't keep records of such things, Henry lied. Finch wrote something in his notebook. I'd like to speak with some of the mothers privately. That won't be possible. They were working. Then I can wait until they return from the fields. Henry's face remained calm. But Martha, who was standing nearby pretending to sweep, saw his hands clenched. Mr. Finch, I believe we've been accommodating to your inspection, but I must insist on some boundaries. These women have work to do. They don't have time for interviews that serve no productive purpose. Finch met his eyes. Mr. Belmont, the purpose of my visit is to assess the conditions and treatment of enslaved people. The presence of numerous light-skinned children born to dark-skinned mothers is directly relevant to that assessment. The air between them turned electric. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice dangerously soft. Mr. Finch, you are a guest on my family's property. I suggest you be careful about the implications you make. The morality of Boston doesn't dictate the realities of Louisiana. These are complex situations with complex histories. Unless you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, I'd recommend you focus your report on the material conditions you came to evaluate. Finch held his ground. I would still like to speak with the mothers. No, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. Finch stared at Henry for a long moment, then turned and walked away toward the guest quarters where he'd been staying. He left Belle Reve the next morning, his inspection incomplete. His report, when it was published 3 months later in a Boston newspaper, mentioned the unusual demographic patterns observed at Belle Reve Plantation, but contained no specific accusations. It was carefully worded, legally safe, and completely ignored by every authority in Louisiana. But the damage was done. Other inspectors began to show interest. Questions started being asked in church gatherings. Whispers spread through the network of plantations along the river, and Henry Beaumont began making plans. It started slowly, so slowly that at first no one was sure it was happening. In January 1855, Claire disappeared from Belle Reve. Sarah woke one morning to find her daughter's sleeping mat empty. She ran from cabin to cabin, panic rising in her throat, asking if anyone had seen Claire. No one had. The overseer, a man named Mr. Webb, who'd replaced Collins years ago, told Sarah that Claire had been transferred to another property for her own good. He wouldn't say where. He wouldn't say why. He told Sarah to get back to work and stop asking questions. Sarah spent 3 days screaming Claire's name in the fields before she went silent. After that, she never spoke another word, not to the other workers, not to her remaining children, not to anyone. She worked. She ate when food was placed before her. She slept when night came. But the woman who'd been Sarah was gone. 2 months later, Thomas vanished. Then Lily, then 2 more of the light-skinned children. By the end of 1855, all 14 of the obviously European-looking children had been removed from Belle Reve. The mothers were told nothing. No explanations were given. No destinations were revealed. The children simply disappeared. Dinah tried to run away to search for Thomas. She made it 12 miles before the dogs found her. When they brought her back, Mr. Webb had her whipped, not severely, but enough to make an example. Your boy is safe, Webb told her as she lay recovering. Safer than he'd be here. Accept that and move on. But how could she accept it? How could any of them accept it? Aunt Ruth, now 68 years old and feeling every year of it, tried to comfort the mothers. But what comfort could she offer? She didn't know if the children were truly safe. She didn't know where they'd been sent. She didn't know if they were alive or dead. All she knew was that Belle Reve had a problem, and the solution had been to make that problem disappear. Martha learned the truth by accident. 2 years later, she was serving dinner at a gathering of plantation owners at Belle Reve when she overheard a conversation between Henry Beaumont and a man named Mr. Lawrence, who owned a plantation called Oak Haven, 30 miles upriver. "How did you solve your situation?" Lawrence asked quietly. glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Apprenticeships, Henry replied. There are families in New Orleans who need household workers. They were willing to take children young, train them. The children get papers declaring them freeborn, mixed-race servants. They are paid a small wage, given room and board. It's an arrangement. And the mothers, they are told the children were given opportunities, which is true in a sense. And if someone checks the records, Henry's smile was cold. The records show those children were never born. There are no birth certificates, no registration. Officially, they don't exist. How can anyone question the disappearance of people who were never there? Martha nearly dropped the serving tray. The children had been erased, their births unrecorded, their existence denied. They'd been transformed from enslaved children who looked too white into free servants whose origins would never be questioned because there was no documentation to contradict the false narratives they'd been given. It was elegant. It was cruel. It was perfectly legal. And it meant the mothers would never see their children again. Because how do you search for someone who officially was never born? But here's what Henry Belmont hadn't anticipated. The problem didn't stop. Even as the first wave of light-skinned children was being erased and relocated, new babies kept being born. 1,856 brought 3 more. 1,857 brought 5. The cycle couldn't be broken because the cause hadn't been addressed. The men who visited Belle-Rive, the overseers who worked the fields, the sons and cousins and friends of the Belmont family, they continued doing exactly what they'd always done, and enslaved women had no power to refuse them. By 1,858, there were 11 new light-skinned children in the quarters, and Henry was running out of apprenticeships to place them in. The families in New Orleans were asking questions. The paperwork was getting complicated. Suspicions were growing. One night, Henry came to his father's room. The old master was dying. Everyone could see it. He had perhaps weeks left, maybe days. "Father," Henry said, "we need to stop this." Old Master Beaumont looked at his son with eyes that had seen too much. "Stop what? You know what?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, the old master spoke, his voice a whisper. "You think I don't know? You think I haven't seen? I built this place. I made the rules. And I broke them myself more times than I can count." Henry said nothing. "Your brother breaks them, your cousins break them, our guests break them, Webb breaks them, and every overseer before him." The old master coughed, a wet sound that spoke of fluid in his lungs. "You want to stop it. Then you need to stop men from being what they are. Good luck with that. We can set rules, punishments for white men." The old master laughed a bitter sound. "Boy, you are talking about punishing your own blood, your own friends, men of property and standing. You think they were going to listen to you when they didn't listen to me. Then what do we do?" The old master turned his head to look out the window at the fields beyond. "You do what I did. You keep it quiet. You move the evidence when it gets too obvious. You deny everything. And you pray. Pray for what? That it all burns down before anyone finds out how deep it goes." Old Master Beaumont died in October 1858. At his funeral, attended by the most prominent families in Louisiana, a young minister who recently arrived from Virginia gave a sermon about judgment and redemption. He spoke about the sins that men carry to their graves and the accounting that awaits them in the hereafter. Several people in attendance shifted uncomfortably in their seats. After the burial, as people gathered at Belle-Rive for the reception, Martha overheard a conversation between 2 elderly women she didn't recognize. They were sitting in the corner of the parlor speaking in low voices. "Did you hear about the Channel plantation?" one woman asked. "The one that burned last year's?" "Yes. When they were rebuilding, workers found a room beneath the old quarters, a hidden room. What was in it?" The woman leaned closer. "Children. The remains of children. At least 15 from what they could tell. All infants. All buried in a row." Martha froze, her hands still on the tray she was carrying. "Dear God," the second woman whispered. Why do you think?" Same reason we are pretending not to notice certain children in certain cabins on half the plantations in Louisiana, except the shores chose a different solution than relocation. The silence that followed was suffocating. It's an evil we don't speak about, the first woman finally said, but that doesn't make it less real. Martha set down the tray and walked out of the room on legs that barely held her. She made it to the outdoor kitchen before she vomited into a bucket. Aunt Ruth found her there 20 minutes later. You heard? Ruth said it wasn't a question. Martha nodded, unable to speak. Now you understand why I told you to put that ledger back. Now you understand why keeping quiet is the only mercy we got. Those babies at Channel are dead and buried and beyond our help. The ones here are alive. They've been given to families in the city. Families that might treat them decent, might give them a life better than this. It ain't right. It ain't fair. But it's the best outcome we could hope for in a world that don't care about right or fair. Martha looked at the old woman. How do you live with it? Ruth's face was ancient in that moment, carved from sorrow and survival. Same way we live with everything else, child. One day at a time, one breath at a time, we survive because that's all we can do. The war came in 1861, though its shadows had been creeping across Louisiana for years before the first shots were fired. Belle Reve, like all plantations, was thrown into chaos. Henry Beaumont left to serve in the Confederate Army. The overseer and most of the white workers followed. The plantation was left under the management of Henry's wife, Elizabeth, and old Mr. Wayne, who was too old to fight. The Union blockade strangled trade. Money became scarce. Resources dwindled. The illusion of order that had kept Belle Reve running began to crack, and in the spring of 1863, something impossible happened. Claire came back. She was 16 years old now, tall and striking, her blonde hair pinned up in the style of city ladies. She arrived in a wagon driven by a man from New Orleans who refused to explain anything. He simply deposited her at the edge of Belle Reve's property and left. Claire stood at the entrance to the quarters, looking around with eyes that barely remembered this place. When Sarah saw her, the woman who hadn't spoken in 8 years let out a sound that wasn't quite human, something between a scream and a sob. She ran to Claire and collapsed at her feet. Claire looked down at the broken woman who was her mother and didn't know what to say. Aunt Ruth, now 76 and moving slowly, came to help Sarah up. She looked at Claire with sharp eyes. You alone? No, Claire said. Thomas is in New Orleans. Lily is in Baton Rouge. Some of the others are scattered. We've been finding each other. Why you come back? Claire's blue eyes were hard because I needed to see it. I needed to remember I was 3 when they took me. I barely remembered this place. But now I do. Over the following weeks, 3 more of the relocated children found their way back to Belle Reve. They were teenagers now, some working as servants in the city, others freed by sympathetic northern families who'd moved to Louisiana during the confusion of war. They'd come back for different reasons. Some looking for mothers, some looking for answers, some looking for revenge. Thomas, now 15, had been working as a clerk for a shipping company in New Orleans. His employer thought he was the son of French immigrants. He'd learned to read and write, to keep accounts, to navigate the world as a free person, but he'd never forgotten where he came from. They told me my mother sold me, Thomas said to Aunt Ruth one evening. They told me she didn't want a child and gave me up for money. That's what they told all of us. Ruth felt tears on her face for the first time in years. Your mamma searched for you till they whipped her for leaving the fields. She screamed your name for months. She ain't sold you, child. They took you. Thomas's face transformed. Rage and grief weared across his features. Where is Sheik? Ruth's silence was answer enough. Dinah had died in 1860, 3 years earlier. Her body was buried in the unmarked plot behind the quarters, where all the enslaved dead went. Thomas walked to that plot and stood there until dark, with Henry away at war and the plantation in disorder. Security in the big house became lax. Martha, still working as a house servant at 60 years old, remembered the ledger. She searched for it over several weeks, looking during her rare moments alone in the master's study. She searched the desk, the cabinets, the shelves. Finally, she found it in a locked drawer in Henry's private office. She broke the lock with a kitchen knife. The ledger had been updated. New entries went all the way to 1854, documenting every light-skinned birth and its suspected paternity. But there were also new sections, relocations, a list of children's names, their new locations in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, the families they'd been placed with, and the false identities they'd been given, financial records, payments made to city families for taking the children, bribes paid to officials to create false documentation, costs associated with maintaining the secret, and at the back of the ledger a section titled simply Complications. Martha read through it with growing horror. It listed children who'd been problematic, those who'd asked too many questions, those who tried to contact their mothers, those who'd threatened to reveal the truth. Next to each name was a notation of how the complication had been resolved. Most had been sold to distant plantations under their false identities, sent so far away they'd never find their way back. 3 were listed as deceased, illness, accidents, drowning. The notations were brief and suspicious. One name made Martha's blood freeze. Thomas. High risk. Monitoring required. Termination considered if returns to Belray. Termination. They'd been planning to kill him if he came back. Martha took the ledger and hid it in a place she'd prepared years ago, a hollow space beneath the floorboards of the outdoor kitchen, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Then she went to find the children who had returned. They met in secret deep in the night in a clearing in the woods beyond the cotton fields. Martha had gathered them, Claire, Thomas, Lily, and Jacob, who'd arrived just days before from a plantation in Mississippi, where he'd been working as a stable hand. She told them about the ledger. She told them everything it contained. And then she gave them a choice. "This book is evidence," Martha said. "It's proof of every crime committed here, every man's name, every child's true origin. It's power." "Power to do what?" Claire asked. "Depends on what you want. You could take it north, give it to those abolition newspapers. Expose Belle Reve and every man named in those pages." Thomas leaned forward. "Would it work? Would anyone care?" Martha hesitated. "Maybe, but probably not. White men been getting away with this since slavery started. One ledger ain't going to change that. Might cause a scandal, might ruin some reputations, but it ain't going to bring justice." "Then why tell us about it?" Lily asked. "Because it's yours, your stories, your truth. You deserve to decide what happens to it." They sat in silence considering. Finally Jacob spoke. He was the oldest at 17 and the quietest. "What's the other choice? You let it disappear. You take the new identities you've been given, and you live as free people. You pass as white. You make lives for yourselves. You survive. You let Belle Reve become your past instead of your future. And our mothers," Cla's voice was sharp, "Sarah can't even speak anymore because of what they did. We just abandoned her. Sarah and the others, they got a chance at freedom coming. War's going to end slavery one way or another. You can see which way the wind's blowing. But if you expose this ledger now, you expose yourselves. Your false papers become evidence of fraud. Your free status gets questioned. You might end up right back in chains or worse." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing. "So we do nothing. We let them win." "They already won," Martha said sadly. "They won the day you was born. This ain't about winning. It's about surviving with enough of yourself left to build something after." The debate went on for hours. Claire wanted to publish the ledger. Thomas wanted to confront Henry directly. Lily wanted to burn Belle Reve to the ground. Jacob wanted to disappear and never look back. In the end, they couldn't agree. So they made a different decision. They would keep the ledger hidden. They would make copies of the most important pages. Each of them would take a copy and hide it somewhere safe. And if anything happened to one of them, if any of them died under suspicious circumstances, the others would ensure the truth came out. It was insurance. It was protection. It was the only leverage they had. Martha gave them the ledger for one night. They worked by candlelight in Aunt Ruth's cabin, copying pages carefully, documenting everything. By dawn, the ledger was back in its hiding place, and the children had melted back into the chance of wartime Louisiana. The war ended in April 1865. News of emancipation reached Belle Reve in June, brought by Union soldiers who occupied the plantation for 3 days before moving on to the next town. The enslaved people of Belle Reve were free, but freedom is complicated. Most had nowhere to go, no money, no prospects, no way to survive outside the only system they'd ever known. Many stayed at Belle Reve, now as paid workers, though paid was a generous term for the script system and sharecropping arrangements Henry implemented. It was slavery by another name, with slightly better conditions and the theoretical right to leave. Sarah was among those who stayed. She was 34 years old, still silent, still broken. She worked the same field she'd always worked, now for pennies instead of nothing. Martha stayed, too. Where else could a 70-year-old former slave go? Aunt Ruth died in 1867, peacefully in her sleep. She was 80 years old and tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Her last words to Martha were simple. Don't let them forget. The light-skinned children who'd been born after the first wave were still at Belle Reve. They were older now, teenagers and young adults. They'd been allowed to stay because by the time they reached adolescence, the war had made their removal impossible. They lived in a strange liminal space, too white to be fully accepted by the black community forming in the aftermath of slavery, too black to be accepted by white society that knew their origins. Some eventually left, moving north or west, passing into white society and never looking back. Others stayed, building lives in the complicated racial landscape of Reconstruction Louisiana. And the mothers who'd been separated from their children in 1855 never saw them again. In 1871, Martha received a letter. This was unusual for several reasons. Martha couldn't remember ever receiving correspondence before. Mail for formerly enslaved people was rare, and Martha had no family she knew of beyond Belle Reve. The letter had been delivered to the general store in town, addressed simply to Martha, formerly of Belle Reve. Someone at the store had brought it to the plantation. Martha took it to her cabin and stared at it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was elegant, educated. The paper was expensive. Dear Martha, you don't know me, but I know who you are. My name is Claire. You knew me as a child before I was taken away in 1855. I'm writing to you because I need to know something, and I believe you may be the only person who can tell me the truth. I've built a life in Philadelphia. I'm married to a merchant. I have 2 children of my own. My husband believes I am the daughter of French immigrants who died when I was young. His family has accepted me without question, but I remember fragments, a woman's face, a small cabin, singing in a language I didn't understand, hands that held me with a love I've never felt since. I've tried to find records of my birth. There are none. I've tried to find records of a woman named Sarah at Belle Reve. The plantation keeps no such detailed records. They say, can you tell me, is she alive? Does she remember Mac? If I came back, would she want to see May? I am asking you to be honest. If it's better that I stay away, I will. I have children to protect, a life to maintain. I can't risk my family's future for a past I barely remember, but I need to know if she's there. I need to know if she remembers. Please write back if you can. And Martha read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down to write a response. It took her 2 hours to compose 3 paragraphs. Her writing was shabby. She hadn't written anything in years, but the words were clear. Dear Claire, she alive. She remember. She never forgot. But she can't speak no more. Not since you left. Her mind somewhere else. Somewhere we can't reach. You got a good life. You got children and safety. Your mamma would want you to keep that. Don't come back. But no, she loved you more than life itself. Still do, Martha. She sent the letter and never heard from Claire again. But 3 months later, An envelope arrived at Belle Reve addressed to Sarah. Inside was a photograph, a formal portrait of a beautiful blonde woman in an elegant dress standing with a bearded man and two small children. On the back, in that same elegant handwriting, was written simply, "Thank you for my life." Martha gave the photograph to Sarah. The woman looked at it for a long moment, her eyes showing recognition that her voice could no longer express. Then she tucked it into her dress close to her heart and returned to her cabin. She kept that photograph until the day she died. By 1875, Belle Reve was struggling. The old plantation system couldn't sustain itself with paid labor, even the exploitative sharecropping system Henry had implemented. Competition from Western states was driving cotton prices down. The glory days were ending. Henry Beaumont, now 51 years old, sat in his father's old study one evening, reviewing ledgers, the official ones, showing the financial collapse of everything his family had built. He pulled out the hidden ledger from its drawer, the one documenting a different kind of accounting. He read through it slowly, looking at names of children who'd be adults now, looking at dates that spanned decades, looking at the initials in the margins that included his own. Henry Beaumont. He'd made 6 entries himself over the years, 6 children who bore his features, carried his blood, and had been erased from history to protect his reputation. He wondered where they were now, if they were alive, if they hated him, if they even knew who he was. Probably better that they didn't. He took the ledger to the fireplace and stared at it for a long time. He should burn it, destroy the evidence, let the past die with the past. But something stopped him. Maybe it was vanity, the need to preserve some record of his own children, even the ones he couldn't claim. Maybe it was fear, the suspicion that copies existed, and destroying the original would only make him look guilty if they surfaced. Maybe it was something else entirely, something he couldn't name. He put the ledger back in the drawer and locked it. It stayed there for another 43 years. In 1918, Belle Reve was sold to a timber company. The Beaumont family had finally surrendered to economic reality. Henry had died in 1903. His children had moved to cities pursuing different lives. The plantation house had fallen into disrepair. The timber company planned to tear down the old house and use the land for lumber operations. During the demolition, workers found the ledger in a sealed compartment built into the wall behind what had been Henry Beaumont's office desk. Someone had hidden it there deliberately, probably shortly before Henry's death. The worker who found it was a young man named William Harris. He was 23, black and literate, part of a new generation born into freedom and education. He opened the ledger and began to read. By the 3rd page, his hands were shaking. By the 10th page, he understood what he was holding. William brought the ledger to his supervisor, a white man named Mr. Carlton, who managed the timber crew. Carlton read through it, his face growing progressively more pale. "This should be reported," William said. "Reported to who?" Carlton asked. "These men are all dead. This plantation doesn't exist anymore. The people involved are scattered or gone. What exactly do you think reporting this would accomplish? It's evidence of crimes. It's evidence of crimes committed by dead men against people who can be identified because there's no record they existed in the first place." Carlton closed the ledger. "You know what happens if this goes public? Scandal, pain, families destroyed, the descendants of both the victims and the perpetrators, and no justice because there's no one left to prosecute. So, we do nothing. We recognize that some truths don't bring healing. They only bring more pain." William took the ledger back. "Then I'll keep it as a record, as proof that it happened, even if no one wants to acknowledge it." Carlton didn't stop him. William Harris kept that ledger for the rest of his life. He showed it to his children when they were old enough to understand. He showed it to his grandchildren. He donated it to a historical society in 1959 at the age of 64, with instructions that it be preserved as documentation of a truth that American history often tried to erase. The Historical Society cataloged it, archived it, and filed it away. Very few people ever looked at it. Sarah died in 1879 at age 48. She was buried in the plot behind what had been the quarters in an unmarked grave near Diner, and dozens of others. She never spoke again after losing Claire the first time, but those who knew her said that in her final years she would sometimes take out a photograph and look at it for hours, her lips moving in silent words no one could hear. Martha lived until 1883, dying at the remarkable age of 93. She'd spent her final years working as a lairess in town, living in a small room above a shop, finally free and more than just name. Before she died, she told the story to her great-niece, a young woman named Harriet, who was training to be a teacher. She told her about the ledger, about the babies, about the systematic erasure of evidence and identity. "Why didn't you expose it?" Harriet asked. "When you had the chance." Martha looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Because exposing it would have gotten people killed. We survived by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. That ain't cowardice, child. That's wisdom bought with blood. But the truth don't always set you free. Sometimes it just gets you buried." Harriet didn't understand then, but years later, when she was researching the history of slavery in Louisiana for a book she was writing, she began to uncover similar stories from other plantations, whispered accounts, fragmentary records, patterns that were impossible to ignore. Babies who looked white born to enslaved black mothers, and children who disappeared without explanation. Families in cities who suddenly had new servants or wards with suspiciously vague origins. It hadn't been unique to Belle Reve. It had been everywhere, woven into the fabric of the entire system, and everyone had known. The white families had known. The enslaved communities had known. The authorities had known. They'd all chosen silence. In the decades following the Civil War, the light-skinned children of Belle Reve scattered across America. Some disappeared into white society completely, their origins known only to themselves. They married, had children, built lives free from the stigma and danger of their births. Their descendants today have no idea of the truth buried in their family histories. Others maintained connections to the black community, building lives in the complicated space of mixed-race identity in America. They faced discrimination from both sides. Too white for some, too black for others. 4. A few actively searched for their origins, trying to piece together the fragments of their early childhood memories with the lies they'd been told and the evidence they could find. Thomas spent 30 years trying to locate other children who'd been relocated from Belle Reve. He created a network, a quiet system of letters and messages, trying to build a record of who they'd been and where they'd ended up. By his death, in 1926, he'd found 23 of the children documented in the ledger. 8 had died young, 15 were alive and scattered from Boston to San Francisco. He documented their stories in a journal that his daughter discovered after his death. She read about her father's origins with shock. She'd been told he was from a French family in New Orleans. She burned the journal, unwilling to risk her own children discovering the truth and having their lives disrupted by it. The pattern of silence continued. The ledger William Harris donated to the Historical Society remained mostly forgotten until 1983, when a graduate student researching plantation economics stumbled across it while searching for financial records from Belle Reve. The student, a young woman named Dr. Andrea Thompson, realized immediately what she was looking at. She spent 2 years verifying the information, cross-referencing dates with other records, tracking down descendants where possible, building a comprehensive picture of what had happened at Belle Reve between 1847 and 1854. Her dissertation, titled Invisible Evidence, Children of Caution at Belle Reve Plantation, was rejected by her committee. The official reason given was insufficient primary sources. The unofficial reason, shared by her advisor over coffee, was more direct. "This is too inflammatory. You are accusing specific families whose descendants are still prominent in Louisiana. You are opening wounds that people don't want opened. Find a different topic." Dr. Thompson refused to drop it. She published her research independently in a small academic journal focused on African American history. It received minimal attention, a few reviews in specialized publications, a brief mention in a newsletter about slavery studies, and then it was largely forgotten again, because the uncomfortable truth is that some stories, no matter how well documented, are stories that society isn't ready to hear. Today, the land where Belle Reve once stood is owned by an agricultural corporation. The big house was demolished in 1924. The slave quarters were burned in 1932. The fields have been replanted, repurposed, reshaped by modern farming techniques. There's no marker indicating what happened there, no memorial to the women who suffered or the children who were erased from existence, but the descendants exist. Scattered across America are people who carry the DNA of Belle Reve's secrets. Some know their history. Most don't. There are white identifying families in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco who have no idea that their great-great-grandmother was born enslaved in a Louisiana cabin. There are black families in the South who know the stories but don't speak them. Keeping the truth alive in oral histories should only within trusted circles. And somewhere in the archives of a historical society in Louisiana, there's a ledger that documents it all, names and dates and crimes recorded in careful handwriting by a man trying to manage a problem he'd helped create. Researchers occasionally stumble across it. Graduate students sometimes request access. Journalists periodically consider writing about it. Most decide against it. The descendants deserve privacy. They reason the past should stay in the past. What good would it do to expose something that happened so long ago? And so the silence continues. The story of Belle Reve raises questions that have no easy answers. How many other plantations had similar ledgers, similar secrets, similar children who disappeared into false identities and uncertain futures? How many families today carry the genetic legacy of these encounters without knowing the truth of their origins? How many women suffered and died without anyone recording their names or their stories? The answer is we don't know. We'll never know because the system that created these situations was also the system that ensured they'd never be fully documented. But we know it happened. The ledger proves that much. Somewhere in America today, there's a person going about their ordinary life, maybe working in an office, raising children, paying taxes, who has no idea that their great-great-great-grandmother was a 16-year-old girl named Sarah, who lost her daughter to a system that valued white supremacy more than human dignity. Somewhere else there's a person who knows the truth and has chosen to bury it to protect descendants who rebuilt lives on foundations of carefully maintained lies. And in Louisiana, in the soil where Belle Reve once stood, there are memories that the earth itself holds, but will never reveal. The babies found in those slave cabins grew up to be people who navigated an impossible world. Some survived by forgetting. Some survived by hiding. Some survived by transforming themselves into someone else entirely. Their stories are American stories woven into the fabric of this nation's history, and threads too tangled to ever fully unravel. The question isn't whether these things happened. The records, fragmentary as they are, prove they did. The question is how we reckon with truths that are simultaneously undeniable and unprovable, documented and erased, known by everyone and spoken by no one. Belle Reve's light-skinned babies are gone now, disappeared into history and genetics and silence, but the legacy remains in family trees that hide certain branches, in DNA that tells stories different from the ones passed down through generations, in secrets kept so long they've transformed into accepted truths. This is what was found in those Louisiana slave cabins. Not just babies with light skin, but evidence of systematic exploitation that everyone recognized and no one acknowledged, proof of crimes that had no legal remedy because the law itself protected the perpetrators. The owners knew why those babies were there. The mothers knew why. The community knew why. The courts knew why. Everyone knew why. And everyone agreed through spoken words or silent complicity to pretend they didn't say.